Picture this scenario. July 2024, Watson Lake, Arizona. Two recreational fishermen, brothers named Jake and Ryan Foster, are out on their boat enjoying a perfect summer morning. They have invested in a new high-resolution fish finder, one of those modern sonar units that can map the lake bottom in stunning detail. They are scanning for the best fishing spots, looking for underwater structures where bass like to congregate, when something appears on their screen that makes them both lean in closer. At 26 feet below the surface, the sonar is showing something that should not be there. Not a rock formation, not a submerged tree. The shape is too regular, too symmetrical. It looks like wings. It looks like the unmistakable silhouette of an aircraft resting on the lake bottom, preserved in the cold darkness of Watson Lake for longer than either of them has been alive. Within hours, the Yavapai County Sheriff's Department has divers in the water. By that evening, they have confirmed what the sonar suggested. It is a Cessna 172, tail number November 3847 Alpha, sitting upright on the lake bottom as if it had simply landed there and decided to stay. The aircraft is remarkably intact, protected by the lake's cold water and low oxygen environment. And inside the cockpit, still strapped into the pilot's seat, are human remains that have been there since August 3, 1958. That tail number, when checked against Federal Aviation Administration records, tells a story that has haunted Arizona aviation circles for 66 years. November 3847. Alpha belonged to Matthew Smith, a 34-year-old pilot who took off from Prescott Regional Airport on a clear summer afternoon and simply vanished. Massive search operations found nothing. His wife and two young sons waited for news that never came. And all that time, he was right there, 8 meters below the surface of a lake that thousands of people fish, swim, and boat on every year. If you are captivated by mysteries hidden in plain sight, by answers that come decades too late, then subscribe right now. Hit that button, turn on notifications, because what I am about to share is a story that will change how you see every body of water you pass. By the end of this video, you will understand why this discovery has reopened questions about weather patterns, pilot decision-making, and the cruel randomness of tragedy that can hide evidence for generations. The question is not just how his plane ended up at the bottom of Watson Lake. The question is, why did Matthew Smith, an experienced pilot on a routine flight, end up flying directly over that lake during the most dangerous weather of the summer? Matthew Smith was 34 years old in the summer of 1958, and everything about him spoke of quiet competence. Standing at 5 feet 11 inches tall with a solid, athletic build that came from years of outdoor work and weekend hiking in the Arizona high country, Matthew had the kind of steady presence that made people trust him instinctively. His dark brown hair was always neatly cut, though by midday it would be slightly disheveled from running his hands through it while concentrating. He had hazel eyes that seemed to see everything, the kind of observant gaze that missed no detail. His hands were a pilot's hands, strong but careful, with long fingers that moved with practiced precision over controls and instruments. He had a small scar on his left thumb from a childhood accident with a fishing hook, something he had gotten at Watson Lake, ironically enough, back when he was 10 years old, and the lake had just been created by damming Granite Creek. Matthew had been born in Prescott in 1924, growing up in a town that was transitioning from its Wild West past into mid-century modernity. His father owned a hardware store on Whiskey Row, and Matthew had worked there through high school, learning the value of honest work and customer service, but his real passion had always been aviation. As a teenager, He would ride his bicycle out to the small airfield north of town just to watch planes take off and land, dreaming of the day he would be in that cockpit himself. World War II gave him that opportunity. Matthew enlisted in the Army Air Forces in 1942 at 18 and trained as a pilot. He flew transport missions in the Pacific. Theater never saw combat, but logged hundreds of hours in challenging conditions, learning to fly through weather, navigate by instruments, and handle emergencies with cool precision. He returned to Prescott in 1946 with an honorable discharge, a chest full of medals he never displayed, and a pilot's license that would shape the rest of his life. By 1958, Matthew worked as a charter pilot and flight instructor based out of Prescott Regional Airport. He owned his Cessna 172 outright, having purchased it new in 1956 when the model first became available. The 172 was revolutionary at the time, a reliable four-seat aircraft that was perfect for the kind of flying Matthew did. Short charter flights to Phoenix or Flagstaff, occasional cargo runs, and flight instruction for students learning to fly. He was known as one of the best instructors in northern Arizona, patient but demanding, never letting students develop bad habits. His typical day started early. Matthew would wake at 5:30 in the morning in the comfortable ranch-style house he and his wife Helen had built on the eastern edge of Prescott, with a view of the mountains that he never tired of. He would make coffee, sit on the back porch watching the sun rise, and mentally review the day's scheduled flights. By 7 in the morning, he would be at the airport, doing pre-flight checks, reviewing weather reports, preparing for whatever the day would bring. Helen Smith had married Matthew in 1948, a romance that bloomed at a community dance where Matthew's quiet charm had won over the vivacious brunette who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. By 1958, they had 2 sons, Robert, age 8, and James, age 5. The boys adored their father, and Matthew would take them up in the Cessna on weekend mornings, circling over Prescott, pointing out their house, their school, the places that made up their world. Robert was already showing interest in aviation, asking technical questions that delighted his father. What made Matthew special as a pilot, what everyone who flew with him remembered, was his caution. He was not reckless. He did not take unnecessary risks. He would cancel flights if weather looked questionable, would turn back if conditions deteriorated, and had a reputation for being almost too conservative in his decision-making. This was a man who understood that getting there safely was more important than getting there quickly. The aviation community in Prescott was small and close-knit in 1958. Maybe 24 regular pilots, mechanics, flight instructors, and airport staff who all knew each other, who looked out for each other, who shared information about weather and conditions and safe routes. Matthew was respected in that community not just for his skill, but for his willingness to help others. He would give free flight instruction to young people who could not afford lessons. He would volunteer for search and rescue operations when hikers went missing in the mountains. He would stay late at the airport helping mechanics troubleshoot problems on other pilots' aircraft. His Cessna 172, tail number November 3847 Alpha, was his pride and joy. He maintained it obsessively, keeping detailed maintenance logs, never skipping inspections, replacing parts before they failed rather than waiting for problems to develop. The aircraft had a distinctive paint scheme, white with blue racing stripes, and Matthew kept it so clean that it always looked brand new. He had named it, though he never told anyone what name, just smiled when people asked. On the evening of August 2nd, 1958, Matthew had dinner with his family as usual. Helen had made pot roast. The boys had argued good-naturedly about who got the last dinner roll, and afterward, Matthew had helped with dishes while the boys did homework at the WTD kitchen table. It was an ordinary evening in an ordinary life, the kind of peaceful domesticity that Matthew had come to treasure after the chaos of war years. He had gone over his flight schedule for the next day with Helen. He had one charter flight booked, taking a businessman from Phoenix to Prescott in the morning, then returning the man to Phoenix in the late afternoon. Simple, straightforward, a route Matthew had flown dozens of times. He would be home by 6 in the evening at the latest, he told Helen. She had smiled, kissed him, and said she would have dinner ready. Matthew kissed his sons good night, telling Robert they would go flying together that weekend if weather was good. He went to bed at 10 in the evening, setting his alarm for 5:30 in the morning, falling asleep to the sound of Helen's breathing beside him, completely unaware that he had less than 24 hours left to live. August 3, 1958, began as one of those perfect Arizona summer mornings that make people understand why humans built cities in the desert. The sky was crystalline blue, the temperature at dawn a comfortable 68 degrees, with light winds from the southwest. Matthew woke to his alarm, went through his morning routine, and arrived at Prescott Regional Airport at 6:45 in the morning, 15 minutes earlier than necessary, as was his habit. He performed his pre-flight inspection of November 3847 Alpha with his usual thoroughness, checked the fuel, both tanks full, walked around the aircraft examining every surface, every control, every potential point of failure, tested the flaps, the ailerons, the rudder. Everything was perfect. The Cessna was in excellent condition, as it always was. At 7:30 in the morning, Matthew took off from Prescott, heading south-southeast toward Phoenix. The flight was smooth, uneventful, taking just under an hour in the morning calm. He landed at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport at 8:24 in the morning, picked up his passenger, a textile salesman named Richard Coleman, who needed to get to Prescott for business meetings, and by 9 in the morning they were airborne again, heading back north. The return flight was equally routine. Matthew and Coleman made small talk about business, about Arizona's growth, about the heat. They landed in Prescott at 10:05 in the morning. Coleman thanked Matthew, paid for the charter in cash, and headed off to his meetings. Matthew refueled the Cessna, did a quick post-flight inspection, and settled in to wait for the afternoon return flight. The weather forecast that morning had been unremarkable. Clear skies, temperatures climbing into the low 90s by afternoon, typical August conditions, with a slight chance of isolated thunderstorms in the mountains later in the day. Nothing concerning. Nothing that would make Matthew cancel or even reconsider the afternoon flight. He spent the middle of the day at the airport, as he often did between flights. He ate lunch with other pilots in the small cafeteria. He reviewed weather updates, noting that a storm system was developing to the northwest, but was not expected to reach the Prescott area until evening. He helped a student pilot who was struggling with radio procedures. He checked on November 3847 Alpha again, making sure everything was ready for the afternoon departure. Richard Coleman returned to the airport at 3:45. In the afternoon, his meetings concluded, ready to return to Phoenix. Matthew filed his flight plan, contacted the control tower, and at exactly 4:08 in the afternoon, November 3847, Alpha lifted off from Prescott Regional Airport, climbing into the afternoon sky with Matthew at the controls and Coleman in the right seat. The flight plan called for a direct route to Phoenix, flying south-southeast at an altitude of 7,500 feet, well below the IFD scattered clouds that had started forming in the early afternoon. Estimated flight time was 55 minutes. Expected arrival in Phoenix was 5:03 in the afternoon. What happened next has been pieced together from radio transmissions, witness reports, and weather data that was preserved in various archives. At 4:22 in the afternoon, Matthew reported his position to Prescott Departure Control, approximately 10 miles south of the airport, climbing through 6,000 feet. Everything was normal. His voice on the recording, preserved in Federal Aviation Administration archives, sounds calm and professional. But the weather that afternoon was developing faster than forecasts had predicted. The storm system from the northwest was moving more quickly and more violently than meteorologists had anticipated. By 4:30 in the afternoon, massive thunderstorms were forming over the mountains between Prescott and Phoenix, cells of severe weather that appeared seemingly out of nowhere, building rapidly in the unstable afternoon air. At 4:35 in the afternoon, Matthew radioed that he was encountering weather, reporting moderate turbulence and building clouds ahead. He requested clearance to deviate from his flight plan, to swing east to avoid the worst of the storm cells he could see developing. Clearance was granted. This was normal, exactly the kind of good decision-making that characterized Matthew's flying. At 4:42 in the afternoon, Matthew made his last radio transmission. His voice was still calm, but more clipped, more focused. He reported that weather was deteriorating rapidly, that he was in instrument meteorological conditions, meaning he could not see the ground, flying entirely by instruments through the clouds and rain. He was diverting further east, he said, trying to get around the storm. He gave his position as approximately 15 miles northeast of Prescott, near Watson Lake area. And then, silence. The next scheduled position report never came. Repeated calls to November 3847 Alpha went unanswered. By 5 in the afternoon, when Matthew should have been landing in Phoenix, air traffic controllers knew something was very wrong. The storm that afternoon was later classified as one of the most severe weather events of the 1958 summer in northern Arizona. Lightning strikes were reported across a wide area. Heavy rain and hail fell in sheets. Wind shear and severe turbulence made flying conditions extraordinarily dangerous. It was the kind of weather that could overwhelm even experienced pilots, the kind of conditions that could tear aircraft apart or force them into the ground. Helen Smith received the phone call at 5:45 in the afternoon. The airport manager, a man named George Patterson, who had known Matthew for years, chose his words carefully. Matthew's flight was overdue. They had lost radio contact. Search operations were being organized, but Helen heard what was not being said. Her husband was missing. The man who had kissed her goodbye that morning might not be coming home. By 6 in the afternoon, as the storm began to clear, search aircraft were taking off. The Civil Aeronautics Board, the federal agency that investigated aircraft accidents before the National Transportation Safety Board existed, coordinated the operation. Military aircraft from nearby bases joined civilian pilots in combing the terrain between Prescott and Phoenix, focusing on the area where Matthew had last reported his position. The search continued through the evening, into the night, with powerful searchlights scanning the desert and mountains, and resumed at first light on August 4th. Dozens of aircraft flew grid patterns. Ground crews hiked through rugged terrain. Searchers looked for any sign: wreckage, fire scars, disturbed vegetation, anything that might indicate where November 3847 Alpha had gone down. They found nothing. The white Cessna with its distinctive blue stripes, so carefully maintained and so brightly painted, seemed to have vanished completely. Over the next week, the search area expanded. Hundreds of square miles were covered. Every canyon, every ridge, every possible location examined and re-examined. Search crews spoke with witnesses who had been in the area during the storm. Several people reported seeing a small aircraft flying low through the clouds near Watson Lake around 4:45 in the afternoon, struggling against the wind and rain. But no one had seen it crash. No one had heard an impact or seen smoke. The plane had simply been there, fighting through the storm. And then it was not. Investigators interviewed Richard Coleman extensively. He could not provide much useful information. Matthew had seemed normal, professional, perhaps slightly more tense than during the morning flight, but nothing alarming. When the weather deteriorated, Matthew had handled it, making the decision to deviate, following proper procedures. Coleman had trusted him completely, and then, in his words, everything had happened very fast. The turbulence, the rain, the sense of the aircraft being tossed around. Matthew's focused attention on keeping them level and under control. Helen Smith spent those first days in a fog of fear and hope. Friends and family gathered at her house. Church members brought food. Neighbors helped with the boys, who were too young to fully understand what was happening but old enough to sense that something was terribly wrong. Helen would stand at the window, looking toward the airport, waiting for news that never came in the form she wanted. By August 15th, 2 weeks after Matthew disappeared, the intensive search was winding down. The Civil Aeronautics Board had covered every reasonable area multiple times. They had found wrecks of other old aircraft, remains of crashes from years earlier, but nothing that belonged to November 3847 Alpha. The conclusion, stated in careful official language, was that Matthew Smith and his passenger had likely crashed in terrain so rugged or remote that the wreckage could not be located with current search technology. Richard Coleman's family held a memorial service in Phoenix. Matthew's service was delayed. Helen could not bring herself to hold a funeral without a body, without proof, without certainty. She kept hoping. Maybe Matthew had crashed, but survived, was injured somewhere, would be found. Maybe the radio had failed, and he had landed safely at some remote airstrip. Maybe, impossibly, there was still a chance. But days became weeks, and weeks became months, and the reality became unavoidable. Matthew Smith was gone. On October 12, 1958, a memorial service was held at the First Presbyterian Church in Prescott. Hundreds attended. The aviation community came out in force, flying missing man formations over the service, honoring one of their own who had been lost to the sky he loved. Helen Smith faced an impossible situation. She was 31 years old with 2 young sons, a mortgage, and a husband who was legally still missing, not deceased, which complicated insurance and benefits. She went back to work as a nurse, relying on family to help with child care. She raised Robert and James alone, doing her best to keep their father's memory alive while dealing with her own grief and confusion. Robert Smith, 8 years old when his father disappeared, grew up with fragments of memory and family stories. He remembered the flights, the feeling of his father's hand on his shoulder as they flew over Prescott, the sound of his father's laugh. But as years passed, those memories faded, becoming more like dreams than concrete recollections. He grew up, served in Vietnam, became a teacher, had his own family. But he never stopped wondering what happened to his father. James Smith, only 5, when Matthew vanished, had almost no direct memories of his father. What he knew came from photographs, from stories his mother and older brother told, from the legend his father had become in family lore. He became an engineer, built a successful career, lived a good life. But there was always that empty space, that absence of a father he had never really known. The 1960s came and went. Watson Lake became a popular recreational area, developed with boat ramps and picnic facilities. People came, From across Arizona, to fish, to swim, to enjoy the rare permanent body of water in the high desert. Thousands of people boated over the exact spot where November 3847 Alpha rested on the bottom, completely unaware of what lay beneath them. Theories about Matthew's disappearance evolved over the decades. Some believed he had crashed in the mountains, that wreckage was hidden in some inaccessible canyon or ravine. Others thought he had gone down in the desert. That wreckage had been covered by sand and erosion. A few suggested he might have made it further than anyone thought, that search areas should have been expanded. No one, apparently, seriously considered that he might be in Watson Lake itself. The lake was not on his flight plan. There was no reason for Matthew to be flying directly over it, and 1958 technology could not search underwater effectively anyway. No sonar, no underwater drones, just limited diving capability in relatively shallow water. Watson Lake's deepest sections, where November 3847 Alpha actually was, exceeded the safe diving depth for the equipment available at the time. Helen Smith lived with uncertainty for 54 years. She never remarried, never stopped wearing her wedding ring, never fully moved on from the August afternoon when her husband flew away and did not return. She stayed in Prescott, working at the hospital until retirement, watching her sons grow up and have families of their own, becoming a grandmother, and eventually a great-grandmother. She died in 2012 at age 85, never knowing what happened to Matthew. Her last words to her sons were a request. If they ever found their father, tell him she never stopped loving him. Robert Smith was 74 in 2024, retired from teaching, living in Prescott Valley. James Smith was 71, retired from engineering, living in Phoenix. Neither had stopped hoping for answers, though after 66 years, hope had become a quiet thing, not really expecting resolution. And then, on that July morning in 2024, Jake and Ryan Foster went fishing on Watson Lake with their new sonar equipment. The call from the Yavapai County Sheriff's Department came on July 18, 2024. Robert Smith answered the phone at his home, expecting a routine call, perhaps from a former student or a friend. Instead, he heard words that stopped his heart. "Mr. Smith, we believe we have found your father's aircraft." The discovery process had moved quickly once the sonar had revealed the aircraft's location. The Sheriff's Department had contacted professional diving teams, and within days they had divers down at the site. The Cessna 172 sat upright on the lake bottom at approximately 26 feet of depth, in a section of Watson Lake that was deep enough to have prevented casual discovery, but shallow enough for modern diving equipment to access easily. The aircraft was remarkably well preserved. The cold water and lack of oxygen at that depth had prevented the kind of rapid deterioration that occurs in warmer, more oxygen-rich environments. The paint was faded, but still visible. The structure was largely intact, and inside the cockpit, still strapped into the pilot's seat, were skeletal remains that would later be confirmed through dental records as Matthew Smith. In the right seat were remains identified as Richard Coleman. The recovery operation took several days. Each piece of the aircraft, each item found inside, was carefully documented before being brought to the surface. The process was treated as both an archaeological dig and a crash investigation, respecting the site as both a grave and a source of evidence. What emerged told the story of Matthew Smith's final moments with heartbreaking clarity. The aircraft showed no signs of mid-air structural failure, no indication that it had been torn apart by turbulence or struck by lightning. Instead, the damage pattern was consistent with a controlled water landing, what is called ditching in aviation terminology. The landing gear was retracted, which is correct procedure for ditching. The flaps were extended, which would slow the aircraft and make a water landing more survivable. The instruments, frozen at the moment of submersion, told the story. Airspeed low, altitude 0, engine instruments showing the engine was still running at a impact. Matthew Smith, fighting through that violent storm on August 3, 1958, had apparently become disoriented or perhaps suffered engine trouble. Finding himself over Watson Lake, possibly unable to see well enough to navigate away, he had made the decision to ditch in the water rather than risk a crash landing in the rugged terrain surrounding the lake. It was sound decision-making, the kind of judgment that might have saved their lives under different circumstances. But what Matthew could not have known, what the investigation revealed, was that the storm's downward winds and turbulence had pushed his aircraft lower than he realized. When he ditched into Watson Lake, thinking he was making a controlled emergency landing, the aircraft hit the water with much more force than intended. The impact, while not catastrophic, was hard enough to compromise the cockpit, to stun or injure both men, to flood the cabin before they could escape. The investigation found that both Matthew and Richard Coleman had died on impact or very shortly after, likely from trauma sustained during the ditching or from rapid drowning as the cabin flooded. Their deaths would have been quick. The aircraft, its weight, and the force of impact driving it down had sunk rapidly to the lake bottom, where it settled into position and remained for 66 years. The recovery of Matthew's remains brought Robert and James Smith to Watson Lake in August 2024, 66 years and 2 weeks after their father had disappeared. They stood at the water's edge, watching the divers work, seeing their father's aircraft emerge piece by piece from the lake that had hidden it for so long. Robert, at 74, wept openly for the father he had lost at 8 years old. He made the right decision, he told reporters who had gathered to cover the story. He ditched in the water to avoid crashing into the mountains. That is what he was supposed to do. It just did not work out the way it should have. James, 71, was quieter but equally emotional. "I wish Mom could have known," he said. "She died wondering. Now we know. He did not suffer. He was doing his job, trying to save his passenger, making the best decisions he could in impossible circumstances. That is who he was." The Civil Aeronautics Board's original investigation, limited by 1958 technology and the inability to find the wreckage, had listed the probable cause as aircraft, accident due to severe weather conditions, wreckage not located. The modern National Transportation Safety Board review, with full access to the wreckage, confirmed and expanded that assessment. Matthew Smith, encountering severe weather and likely suffering at least partial instrument failure or spatial disorientation, had attempted an emergency water landing in Watson Lake. The ditching was executed properly, but the conditions, including strong downward winds, had resulted in a high-impact water entry that proved fatal. The report noted that Matthew's decision to ditch in the lake rather than attempt to fly through the storm or land in mountainous terrain was consistent with proper emergency procedures and likely represented his best chance of survival. It simply had not worked out. Sometimes, even when pilots do everything right, tragedy still occurs. So what really happened on August 3, 1958? The evidence now tells a clear story. Matthew Smith, caught in a violent summer thunderstorm, found himself over Watson Lake either by navigation error in the storm or because he was deliberately heading there for an emergency landing. Realizing he could not safely continue, he made the decision to ditch in the water. He followed proper procedures, configured the aircraft correctly, and executed the ditching as well as could be expected under terrible conditions. But the storm's severe downdrafts, invisible and unpredictable, caused the aircraft to hit the water much harder than intended. The impact killed or incapacitated both men and caused the aircraft to flood and sink rapidly. The Cessna 172 settled on the lake bottom, and there it stayed. Searches in 1958 focused on land, on mountains and desert where aircraft crashes were expected to occur. No one thought to search Watson Lake thoroughly. The technology did not exist to effectively scan the lake bottom. And even if someone had suggested it, why would Matthew Smith, whose flight plan took him nowhere near the lake, be there? It was chance, terrible luck, the kind of tragic coincidence that makes families ask why for generations. If the storm had developed an hour later, Matthew would have completed his flight safely. If he had been 5 miles in any other direction, he would have had different emergency landing options. If the downdrafts had not been so severe at that exact moment, the ditching might have been survivable. Matthew Smith was laid to rest in September 2024, in a ceremony attended by hundreds. His sons, now elderly men themselves, buried their father with full military honors, recognizing his World War II service. Representatives from the aviation community came from across Arizona. The mayor of Prescott spoke about Matthew's contributions to the town and to aviation. A missing man formation flew overhead, one aircraft breaking away to symbolize the pilot who would never return. Helen Smith's grave, in the same cemetery, is marked with a headstone that gives her dates, 1927 to 2012. After the service, Robert and James had a new inscription added, "Reunited with Matthew, 2024. It was the closure their mother had deserved but never received. Watson Lake continues to be a popular recreation area. There is now a small memorial plaque near the shore, dedicated to Matthew Smith and Richard Coleman, acknowledging the tragedy that unfolded in those waters 66 years ago. Boaters and fishermen pass it regularly, most never knowing the full story. But the plaque ensures that Matthew Smith will not be forgotten again. The case raises questions about how many other missing aircraft might be hidden in America's lakes and reservoirs. How many other families are waiting for answers that lie beneath water that has never been properly searched? Modern sonar technology, the kind that Jake and Ryan Foster were using as recreational fishermen, has become so sophisticated and accessible that discoveries like this may become more common. For Robert and James Smith, the discovery brought mixed emotions: relief at finally knowing what happened to their father, grief at having the loss confirmed after decades of uncertainty, pride in learning that their father had died doing exactly what he had been trained to do, making sound decisions under pressure, trying to save his passenger's life, and sadness that their mother never got to know, never received the closure that might have allowed her to truly move forward. Matthew Smith was 34 years old, a skilled pilot, a devoted husband and father, when he died trying to survive a storm that should never have developed as quickly and violently as it did. He deserved better than to spend 66 years at the bottom of a lake, while his family wondered and grieved without answers. His passenger, Richard Coleman, deserved better than to be forgotten in a case that faded from memory. But at least now, their stories are complete. At least now, the families know. At least now, after more than 6 decades, Matthew Smith can finally rest in peace, his duty done, his sacrifice recognized, his memory preserved not just as a mystery, but as a testament to a pilot who did everything right and was still claimed by circumstances beyond his control. If you have information about other long-missing aircraft in Arizona or anywhere else, authorities encourage you to come forward. Modern technology has made it possible to solve mysteries that previous generations could not. Every missing pilot, every unsolved disappearance represents a family still waiting for answers. Matthew Smith's story is now complete. May his memory serve as a reminder that every missing person deserves to be found, that answers matter no matter how long they take to arrive, and that sometimes the water holds secrets that only time and technology can reveal.